Well, today we have kind of added to the agenda Jeff Littlejohn, who's going to be speaking about alternatives in looking at septic tank replacement. Jeff, you're up.
Oh, well, actually, before him.
Okay, sorry.
We're tag teaming today. I'm standing in for Brian Lapointe, so I'm going to cover.
Okay, yeah. I saw Jeff on the thing. Sorry, got ahead of you. Go for it.
No, that's great. So we just wanted to provide a briefing on the latest research related to septic tank pollution and how conditions of septic tank systems and where they're placed can contribute to nutrient pollution into ground and surface waters, leading to water quality and ecological health declines. And this relates to our CCMP Water Quality Improvement Priority Action 4 and 4.2, which specifically talks about supporting conversion of septics to sewer. Next slide, please. All right, so sorry guys, Brian Lapointe was supposed to be here in person. He had a personal issue arise last minute that prevented him from doing it. He sends his regards, but he is letting us use his PowerPoint and his script, so I'll do my best to stand in for him. First, Dr. Lapointe, a little bit about him. He has over 40 years of experience in nutrient and harmful bloom research. He began working with nutrients and harmful algae blooms back at, many years ago. The photo on the right shows an experiment it's on the left, on experiment in 1974, where they were dosing fast-growing red drift algae like Gracilaria with mixtures of sewage and seawater from the Indian River Lagoon. And in that experiment, the algae grew really quickly. And most of this work was performed as part of his PhD when algae blooms were prominent in Hillsborough Bay, which we just heard about. He also worked with a group to develop a national research agenda called EcoHab, a program that's in response to expanding algae blooms, which is still functioning. And at the time, Dr. Lapointe had been studying macroalgae blooms in the Florida Keys and Southwest Florida in connection to septic systems. And then lastly, he contributed to the Clean Coastal Waters book published by the National Research Council, which focuses on the effects of nutrient pollution on waterways. Next slide, please. So some of the critical issues for the estuaries and coastal waters in Southwest Florida include nutrient, microbial, and contaminant pollution, and nutrients contributing to harmful algae blooms. We also are experiencing, as we've discussed, loss of seagrass, declines in fisheries, and emerging diseases and health impacts that affect wildlife and humans. Additionally, Charlotte Harbor has been impaired in different segments, meaning that it's not meeting those standards that we were talking about that are safe for its designated use with regards to excess nutrients, dissolved oxygen, chlorophyll A, shellfish bacteria, and fish tissue mercury. The map on the right is the fecal coliform 10-year average compiled in June 2015 that shows the higher values greater than 400 CFU in the Port Charlotte area, where many septic systems are present. Excess nitrogen is also an issue, and there's also a hot spot near Hancock Creek in the North Fort Myers area. Next slide, please. So septic systems have become an increased problem, and they correlate with population growth. Here on the left, you see population growth of Charlotte County, and on the right of Lee County. The graph on the left, in addition to the population, it shows that, where Dr. Lapointe worked with Charlotte County staff to gather this data, the population curves in blue, the chlorophyll A are the black dots, which has increased with population. The red line is the numeric nutrient criteria threshold for this system, which we are well above. The concern is that the increase in chlorophyll A in the water from phytoplankton is reducing the light, reaching seagrasses, and leading to the loss of them. And as you can see, due to algae blooms has resulted in the loss of seagrasses in other systems like the Indian River Lagoon, which has lost 95% of its seagrass and led to a mass manatee mortality event due to them starving. The graph on the right is just the population curve in Lee County. And historic data has not yet been integrated into this graph, but you can see similarly a large growth in population, which correlates, next slide, to increased septics. About a third of households in Florida rely on septic systems. About 12% of all septic systems nationally are located right here in Florida. Florida has highly sensitive water bodies, including springs, estuaries, coral reefs that are very sensitive to contaminants and nutrients. Most soils in Florida are really not suitable to septic systems due to their porous sands and karst limestone. The soils have low organic carbon content, which is required for denitrification bacterial activity, along with a high water table that will become a bigger and bigger problem with sea level rise. Affluent contaminants from septic systems include nutrients, pharmaceuticals, hormones, bacteria, viruses, and metals. In the modeling study here showed there was a study back in 2012 where agricultural and residential fertilizer were shown to be the largest nitrogen sources, followed by septic systems. And Dr. Lapointe's research that occurs in the Indian River Lagoon and in Lee and Charlotte counties also found that wastewater and septic systems to be one of the leading sources of nitrogen driving harmful algae blooms, along with atmospheric nitrogen and reclaimed water as other contributing sources of nitrogen. The diagram on the right here shows the drainage field for a septic system and illustrates how the separation between that septic field and the water table is absolutely key to its effective functioning. Next slide. These plots, I know, are a lot to look at, but I'm going to try to explain them briefly. Our work that Dr. Lapointe has done right in here in Charlotte and Lee counties. So the state code requires 2 feet of separation between a drain field and the seasonal high water table in the wet season. And when you add another 1.5 feet that's generally required for the installation of a septic system from grade of the soil, there's a minimum separation of 3.5 feet supposed to occur between the ground surface and the seasonal high water table. But based on monitoring well data, which is represented here from Dr. Lapointe's work, 71% of septic systems in Charlotte County had less than 3 feet of separation. And in the North Fort Myers and Hancock Creek area, 87% were less than 3 feet of separation. In the Lee County study, most of those wells were greater than 3.5 feet that you see there were the reference wells that were outside the project area. So really an overwhelming number of septic systems that are really not properly functioning because they were never properly constructed. There are many septic systems in low-lying areas that don't have this separation needed to function properly the way they would with greater aerobic zone. Next slide. So this is a summary chart showing the results from the North Fort Myers study for groundwater. The sites include a reference site at the top, Hancock Creek, Central Drainage Feature, and Powell Creek. These 3 areas were sampled for bacteria, pharmaceuticals, an artificial sweetener called sucralose, and dissolved reactive nutrients and stable nitrogen isotopes. In some cases, there were high levels of bacteria present and high biological oxygen demand levels that exceed state standards. Pharmaceuticals were found in medium to low concentrations. Artificial sweetener sucralose has shown to be an excellent tracer of human waste because it goes right through people and right through treatment systems and septic systems. So we did find, or Dr. Lapointe found, that this was very high values, exceeding standards in these areas. And for nutrients, there were some very high values for nitrogen, and particularly ammonium. Ammonium is found at medium to high levels compared to nitrate. And with lower values, those values indicate that there was not enough separation in the drain fields to get denitrification from ammonium to nitrate. Ammonia, being the most reduced form of nitrogen, is the best form to support a harmful algae bloom. Soluble reactive phosphorus, total nitrogen, and total phosphorus were also found in very high values, as well as N15, which indicates that it was traveling through groundwater. Slide 8. Next slide, please. So this is a summary chart that shows the results from the same study area for surface waters. In surface waters, they found very high levels of bacteria exceeding standards. They found pharmaceuticals in low to medium values. Sucralose was diluted down to more medium values in surface waters. The nitrogen, ammonium, nitrate, and dissolved inorganic nitrogen were at medium values because these surface waters have algae present, which is actually assimilating the nitrogen nutrients due to it being a very nitrogen limited system. And then residential phosphorus is also present in the water with dissolved soluble reactive phosphorus and total phosphorus in high values. This is the expected residual buildup from the next limiting nutrient. And additionally, wastewater nitrogen has gone from being in the dissolved reactive form in the groundwater into a particulate form shown with these N15 values measured in the particulate organic matter in the algae. The nitrogen has gone from the groundwater to the surface water, is being taken up by the algae at high values of 3 parts per mil, indicating that wastewater as its source, because values under 3 parts per mil are generally synthetic nitrogen fertilizer ranges. The surface water is being influenced by wastewater, is what basically this graph shows. Next slide. So this is some historic work that Dr. Lapointe conducted in Lee County back in 2004. And his research came to the same conclusion that wastewater was a primary source driving the blooms of red drift macroalgae that began back in 2003. There were N15 values of 5.7 to 7.1 parts per mil. And remember, anything over 3 indicates that a source is usually wastewater. Next slide, please. Additionally, in 2005, there was a red tide bloom after the abundance of rainfall from an active hurricane season in 2004 and 2003. This image shows his colleague collecting red tide off of Sanibel in September 2005. The N15 values then ranged from 6.8 to 9.5 parts per mil, again indicating wastewater as a source. By looking at the red tide distribution map on this right from the state database, you can see that even though the blooms are seeded by the Carina brevis offshore, there was very high biomass, greater than 1 million cells per liter close to shore, which is influenced by drainage from the land, which includes wastewater nitrogen. Next slide, please. In 2017 and 2018, there was a red tide bloom that caused a major runoff event from Hurricane Irma. Hurricane Irma brought a lot of rain, and there were some headlines that highlight that wastewater infrastructure was a problem, which will be exacerbated, unfortunately, by more intense storm and rainfall events in the future due to climate change. A year before Irma in 2016, the American Society of Civil Engineers gave Florida an average value for infrastructure and estimated that $18.4 billion was needed in wastewater infrastructure upgrades to bring infrastructure up to standards at that time. Next slide, please. This data set is from the blue-green algae bloom in the Cape Coral canals back in July 2018. The stable isotope nitrogen values on the left in the blue-green algae was measured from Lake Okeechobee down the Caloosahatchee and into the Cape Coral canal area. Oops, if someone would mind muting. The values increased going from the lake to the estuary. So this shows the contributing influence of nitrogen in part from wastewater. The dissolved inorganic nitrogen data decreases at the lock, but increases in Cape Coral and is the same also is the case with phosphorus. Next slide, please. So I believe, unfortunately, I think that was oh no, this is right. Okay. So looking at this, what you're seeing here on the left in the green bars is the St. Lucie estuary going across Lake Okeechobee, which is in the orange, over to our coast, the Caloosahatchee estuary, which is in the green. So what you see at top is the ammonium on top goes from the St. Lucie across Lake Okeechobee to the Caloosahatchee, and you see that the highest values are in the urbanized estuary areas. The phosphorus values show the same results with relatively low values in the lake and higher values towards the estuaries. And the N15 value, which is the particular organic matter itself, the values are generally above 3 in the estuaries, which is that red line there and indicates wastewater inputs. So this is not to say that Lake Okeechobee is not a factor, but of course there's the compounding factor on top of any Lake Okeechobee nutrient loading of these other sources of nutrients on top of that, which would be coming from, in some cases, failing septics. Next slide, please. So this slide just thanks all the partners and organizations who work with Dr. Lapointe, including the CHNEP, Charlotte County and Lee County Board of County Commissioners, Lisa Krieger, Roland Ottolini, Lee County environmental staff, FDEP, his team at Florida Atlantic University Harbor Branch, and many others who were involved in all these different research projects. Next slide, please. Basically, to conclude, Florida is not alone with this problem of septics near waterways polluting them. These are some red drift algae blooms that are happening in the south shore of Cape Cod. It's an invasive red algae being fed by septic tank effluent. Some of Dr. Lapointe's colleagues have conducted modeling studies of nitrogen going into those coastal waters, and they have concluded that 5 to 80% of nitrogen loading into that base, I think it's like 75 to 80% of nitrogen loading to those bays is coming from septic systems. So a large proportion in that area. And final slide, please. So for my portion of the presentation, I just wanted to conclude by illustrating a solution. This is the Kudrow Regional Advanced Wastewater Treatment Plant. We just talked about how effective AWT can be. The influent nitrogen level is 80 milligrams per liter, and it's only 1 milligram per liter coming out of this plant. So it goes from 80 to 1. That's how effective these plants now are able to remove that nitrogen. It removes 98% or more of the nitrogen from the sewage effluent. And shortly after this plant went online, that area was hit by Hurricane Irma, and there was no sewage spills in the Florida Keys. So it's just an example of what can be done with those wastewater infrastructure upgrades and helping to convert septic to sewer wherever possible. And then with that, I'm going to turn it over to my co-presenter, Jeff Littlejohn, who's going to talk about what to do also in some areas where we're not able to convert individual septics to sewer. So with that, thank you. And Jeff, go take it away.
Thank you, Jennifer. I really appreciate it. And Chair Iglehart, thanks for letting me join this group as well. I know we've been talking a lot about the impacts of septic tanks on waterways, and Dr. Lapointe has done a tremendous amount of work. I just had to show this slide because of the toilet bowl from the Florida Trend article back in 2019. And this article heavily cited Dr. Lapointe's studies around the state. So you can see right there on the kind of the opening graphic on that article, they attribute a quote to Dr. Lapointe. I just love the picture. So I've been incorporating into our slides as we're talking to people about, the problems with septic tanks. Next slide, please. The good news is I think Florida at the governor's level and at the state legislative level have absolutely responded to the public call of action. We have an unprecedented amount of funding available to address septic tank pollution. That Cujo Advanced Wastewater Plan is a beneficiary of some of that funding. There's been a tremendous amount of funding in Monroe County and in other parts of the state to upgrade our wastewater treatment plants, extend the reach of collection systems, and we're getting a lot of improvements. And I think a lot of people that have been involved in supporting these efforts deserve a lot of credit, because we're doing some really great work. And like Jennifer just said, Cujo is a great example. We've got not just funding, we've got regulatory drivers. Thanks to the Springs and Aquifer Protection Act in 2018, more recently the Clean Waterways Act in 2020, there are many parts of Florida where a conventional septic tank cannot be permitted or should not be permitted. And unfortunately, there's still some examples of permitting. And unfortunately, in 2019, I think the Department of Health data suggests that we added about 16,000 septic tanks in just 2019, in 1 year. So we still have a lot of work to do, even with the regulatory and economic drivers. But these regulatory and economic drivers do create a lot of incentive to find solutions. And thankfully, one of the things that I've been working on with the Department of Environmental Protection for the last 4 years is approval of a new type of technology to reach homes and businesses, generators of wastewater that are beyond the reach of wastewater collection systems, but with utility grade sewer service, utility owned operated equipment, professional utility operators, and be able to reach those homes and businesses without running a pipe to their homes. We're calling that, it's been called distributed sewer. The department has a more technical term called distributed wastewater treatment systems. I'm going to describe both, and on the next slide, I'm going to show you an example of where that's being implemented right here in Florida through a utility in the city of Apopka. So next slide, please. So this is a case study. It's relatively recent, November 2020. So this has just been kicked off less than 6 months ago. But the first department permit in Florida for a distributed wastewater treatment system is just over a year old. So this is really still pretty new. And that followed 3 years of pilot testing in Lake County and Volusia County by DEP. But in the city of Apopka, the city is entirely within the Wekiva priority focus area for Wekiva Springs, so it's eligible for septic to sewer springs funding. And $2 million in grant funding was made available to retrofit septic tanks in the Wekiva Springs PFA. The city of Apopka identified a neighborhood that was miles outside of the collection system. It's actually the closest neighborhood to the Wekiva Springs State Park. The neighborhood is called Wekiva Glen. And that neighborhood had been campaigning for a replacement or a solution for the septic tanks for many years. And they were very strong supporters of the funding. There's a lot of friends of Wekiva Springs that live in that neighborhood. Again, they back up to the spring, and they were very vocal supporters. But economically and the feasibility of extending sewer lines out was is an issue. There are going to be many parts of Florida that cannot be reached with a conventional underground collection system, and this was one of them. So the city took advantage of the newly approved technology. The city of Apopka was not the first utility to receive a permit, but I think it was the second utility to receive a permit. And then late last year, after city council approval, the mayor went out with a virtual town hall, got a bunch of people from the Wekiva Glen neighborhood on a Zoom and said, hey, we're going to allow anybody in the Wekiva Glen neighborhood to sign on to the City of Apopka program, and it'll be first come, first served, and I've got this much money available. And when you sign up, you're going to get one of these distributed wastewater treatment units. The next slide will describe a little bit more about that, so I'll get to the unit here in a second. But basically, just with that public announcement, some workshops, a website, some social media, and some flyers that went out to interested homeowners, 30 people signed up in the first 30 days, and we started installing units in March. So next slide, please. So this is just an example of a unit going in the ground. This is a distributed wastewater treatment unit, and a unit in a distributed wastewater treatment system is an individual treatment unit that functions like a miniature wastewater treatment plant. It's remotely controlled. It's an activated sludge sequencing batch reactor. It's controlled by an onboard computer. There are moving parts inside. It does require power, but it is also connected through the internet back to the utility, and utility operators operate this equipment remotely. And so it's operating in a SCADA environment. And SCADA, for those of you who don't know, supervisory control and data acquisition, that's an operating system for a wastewater utility. So this is operating in a similar operating environment to a conventional wastewater treatment plant, but they're virtual, they're decentralized, they're remote, and but that central control is available through the internet. So the process of converting one of an existing home with an existing septic tank that signs up for the program is, so step one, they sign up, and then an inspector goes out, inspects their existing drain field, and locates the septic tank and identifies whether there are any challenges to installation. During that site inspection, a flow test is done on the existing drain field, and if the drain field is found to be inadequate, the homeowners is notified that they're going to need to have a drain field repair or replacement as a part of the program to participate. These units do require a drain field. The drain field does handle the effluent disposal. But the amount of treatment in that drain field and the distance to groundwater is less important because the quality of water that comes out of the unit is regulated by DEP to secondary wastewater treatment standards. So the maximum total nitrogen that is allowed to be discharged by one of these units is 20 milligrams per liter. The actual performance, and Dr. Lapointe coincidentally is doing third-party testing on the first utility installed system in Polk County, and the average performance to date is 11.4 milligrams per liter. So we're well under the DEP requirement. Anyway, so the unit does require a drain field, so we do a drain field test, and then during installation, the existing septic tank is abandoned. This unit is installed, typically right next to where the old drain field was, and then the unit is plumbed into the home and plumbed into the drain field and commissioned. And commissioning is a term of art used in the department for the commissioning of a wastewater treatment facility. And these units are in fact commissioned the same way. The same forms are required. These units are regulated like a domestic wastewater treatment facility. So an engineer does sign off on every one of these installations, and the department receives that engineer sealed certification on every one of these units. And then finally, the site is restored with sod. And this homeowner becomes a sewer customer of the city of Apopka. So each one of these homeowners is paying a sewer bill, and that sewer bill covers the cost of ongoing maintenance of the equipment. Next slide, please. So this is distributed sewer, and I've explained some of this already, but it's sewer on demand anywhere. You do not need to be able to run a pipe to a home in order to provide sewer service to that home with this type of technology. And it's not just a next generation septic tank. These are in fact activated sludge SBRs. So it's a 3-stage treatment process. The units are constantly monitored by a computer. It's Siemens powered PLCs and industrial computers, and it's running in an industrial cloud-based operating system. And as I said before, these units are owned and operated by a utility, and they are operated by state licensed wastewater operators. So the homeowner is not involved in the operation. The homeowner just has to pay a monthly sewer bill. And in the city of Apopka, it's $44 a month. And that's all they have to do is pay the bill and flush the toilet. So just like they're connected to conventional sewer. 15 of these have been installed in Apopka to date, and we still have 20 more in the backlog. And the mayor is already actively talking about getting more funding and expanding the program. We're conversations with lots of other communities in Central Florida. And I'm not trying to, Jennifer told me not to try to make this an infomercial, so I'm not going to try to ask anybody on the call to help get your local utility to sign up, but we're ready to go. A couple other things here. These units do discharge underground. And so the risk of failure does not include the risk of a pressurized sanitary sewer overflow. So you're not talking about a pressurized collection system and miles of force main. So a failure is relatively controlled compared to a conventional wastewater plant. And remember that they're discharging to a drain field in lieu of a septic tank. And so even if there's a period of time like a extended power outage, like during a hurricane, these units will overflow eventually, and they will overflow into a drain field. But in that scenario, they're acting essentially like a conventional septic tank for that period of time during an extended power outage. But as soon as the power is restored, the units will boot back up and begin to continue performing their treatment. Next slide, please. I think it may be my last slide. Oh, no, I'm sorry, I forgot. So a couple of slides on DEP and then on funding. So this is a little bit of information about the DEP vernacular, some rule references, a little bit more about pilot testing. And I do want to point out that a single distributed wastewater treatment system permit covers an entire utility service territory. So in the city of Apopka, the city gets one distributed wastewater treatment system permit, and they could, there's 16,000 septic tanks left in Apopka. They could potentially replace all 16,000 under that single permit. Next slide. So this is the funding that's available in 21-22, and this is assuming the line item veto doesn't impact any of these and the budget is approved as passed. But there is a significant amount of funding available for septic to sewer. We have confirmed by the department, we have already received with distributed sewer, our communities that we work with have already received septic to sewer grant funding. So because these are domestic wastewater treatment facilities, not upgraded septic tanks, they're eligible for septic to sewer funding. So this is the funding online for the upcoming fiscal year, and it is unprecedented, thanks in large part to the $500 million supplemental funding from the federal government that got added to the wastewater grant program. Interestingly, not just state funding is coming online. The city of Jacksonville just approved a public referendum yesterday to add 6 cents to every gallon of gas sales, and they're going to bond that to create a $100 million program to do septic to sewer, and distributed sewer is on the list of options there too. And I think that's my last slide. I just have a contact slide, but I'd be happy to answer any questions, go back into the presentation and talk technical or whatever y'all would like to do. We've got 5 more minutes.
Could you just repeat which state, Laura Carr, thank you very much for that information. But which state just added 6 cents to their gas?
City of Jacksonville.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Jeff, I just wanted to say I'm super excited as a person who actually is unfortunately on septic. I'm on an aerobic system, which I used to think was better, but have been educated to learn that is not much better than a regular septic, but you know, live on a waterway. So I think it's wonderful that we finally, I'm in a rural area, so conversion of septic to sewer is never going to hit my neighborhood. So it's nice to see that now there's better alternatives, and maybe at some point I can replace, you know, with something that's going to do some better treatment than what I have. Can you go into a little bit about the cost? Because I think, you know, you and I talked about that that's going to be probably the linchpin. We're really incentivizing and getting homeowners behind this. And I mean, there's definitely some funding and cost sharing at the state level, but overall, what is the cost? And even if it was unsubsidized, how would it compare to the price of a regular system?
So in the city of Apopka, a septic to distributed sewer conversion costs the city $14,000 per conversion. So that includes the drain field inspection, the septic tank abandonment, the installation and commissioning of the new unit, and the sod. So they even included the sod in their program. So all of that is about $14,000. I think that's going to be a good number in most communities. The cost of the equipment is $10,500 right now at current scale.
And then the remainder is the drain field?
Yes. I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. If the homeowner does not, if their drain field is not functioning or doesn't pass the flow test, the cost of the drain field is borne by the homeowner in the APOPCA program, the way they set that up. And I think that's probably the right policy. I've told the mayor I think that's the right policy, because there are lots of homeowners in that neighborhood that have already gone through the expense of replacing their drain field and have a modern era chambered drain field that works fine. And I think some of those homeowners would feel it was unfair if they came out of pocket for the drain field and then the next person came along and got a free one. Plus, it allows the state dollars to go farther, right? But it's a balancing point, right? Because there'll be some trade-offs. Some homeowners may not volunteer if they know they have to come out of pocket for a drain field, or they may wait until their drain field fails and then come into the program at that time. So there are some competing policy points here about how to get as many conversions as possible without crossing over that mandatory, without making it mandatory. And that's something that, at least in the city of Apopka, that was important to the mayor, is that this be a voluntary program.
Jennifer? This
Go
is
ahead.
Debbie Carey from Punta Gorda. I'm excited to hear about this because we are in the middle of a PR battle with septic to sewer in our community. And I would just like to say that I don't even think it's the cost. We are getting resistance to it because it's government overreach, government mandating. I think we have to do a much better job of education before we start throwing numbers at people of, what it's going to cost them. They have to see a value in it. And we have a pocket in the middle of our community that sits right on a canal. And unfortunately, it is not a part of the city. However, they are in our utilities district. And I mean, they are adamant that they will not connect to sewer no matter what we do. We had a company come in and tell us where our hot spots were with the septic system. This was the #1 spot in almost all of Charlotte County, and it sits right on a canal. And they're just adamant they're not going to do it. They see no value. So I think we've got to, as a group interested in water quality, do a much better job of education.
Debbie, I think that's very astute, and that is a response that I've heard from talking with a lot of community leaders around the state. The pushback on the perception that this is government overreach, or there may be septic tank problems, but it's not my septic tank that's causing the problem. I think that's a real powerful force in the politics of septic to sewer. I think in a conventional septic to sewer conversion project, a lot of communities are trying to build a significant consensus, supermajority type of consensus in a neighborhood before they go forward. And waiting for 60 or 70% approval can take a long time. City of Jacksonville is doing that in their conversion program, as they're waiting until they get 70% of a neighborhood to sign up before the utility commits to going in and retrofitting that neighborhood. Unfortunately, even in that scenario, it means you have 30% of the homeowners that are avidly against it, right? And those present challenges to elected officials. With distributed sewer, the first come, first served model means that in that pocket community that you described, not everybody has to be on board. In fact, just one person has to say they want to do it, and that one person can convert. It doesn't cost their neighbor anything. So the program can be implemented on a home-by-home basis. And I agree that education is really important, but I think the fact that you don't have to go do the entire neighborhood at once, and when you do that, make all of those people convert, I think it eases the pressure of accepting a program like this, where you can run it like a gas water heater rebate program. You create the incentive, you help offset the costs, you tell people all the reasons, economic, environmental, or otherwise, why this may be a good idea for them, and then let people vote with their conscience or vote with their pocketbooks. And some people are going to do it because they think it's the right thing to do, and if the service is available, they'll take it. And that's been our experience in Wekiva Glen. Every homeowner that I've talked to, and I've met almost all of them, they've said, I did it because I thought it was the right thing to do. I wanted to do my part. And that does not represent the majority of the homeowners in the neighborhood. It's a small minority, but we gave that minority the opportunity to do this that they didn't otherwise have. And those neighbors, when they start to convert, they talk to their neighbors and they say, you know what, this has been painless, and and it's doing the right thing for the spring, and we can share the data. We can give them the report from their unit. I mean, I'm hoping, and we don't have this yet, but I'm hoping we'll have some homeowners that want to know, how is my performance? What's happening in my treatment unit, and kind of be proud of it. These are, we generate a lot of data. We can share that data with utility, with the neighborhood, if they even care. And I think that incrementalism approach will be a way to get a lot of people converted. And if you just did voluntary and just relied on people's minds and hearts and minds changing, you would see some type of conversion rate. And I don't pretend to know what it would be in your part of the world, Debbie. But if you added some other triggers, like an addition to a home, or a home sale, or a remodel, or a tear down replacement. So if you created some voluntary opportunities, but then added a mandatory component at certain triggered events, I think it's less likely to cause a lot of political pushback than if you did a wholesale mandatory conversion program, with a defined schedule that just grabs everybody, right? So that way the person who may be on fixed income and just wants to be left alone, you just leave that person alone, and eventually someday they sell their home and you get the conversion then.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Littlejohn. Much appreciated. We're running into the next one.
John?
So we have the chat. If folks want to ask you questions, stay on, please.
Oh, I think Commissioner Doherty might be trying to ask a question.
Okay, Commissioner, go for it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jeff, a question for you relative to the requirement for a drain field for this distributed system. You said in many cases the drain field, that the existing drain field would be utilized. Does that drain field have to be checked to meet current health department standards for water table separations and so forth, or is it grandfathered in, so to speak?
It's a great question, Commissioner, and the department has allowed us to just do a flow test, but they are not applying Department of Health vertical separation standards to existing drain fields.
So it just has to hydraulically function.
Correct. And I think that's going to be very helpful to accelerate conversions as well, because I think if a homeowner knows that they come into the program and have to come in with a mounted drain field, I think that's going to be a disincentive to conversion. And I think the department, and they're data driven. This isn't on the merit of my power of persuasion. This is a data driven decision. We're seeing, so Dr. Lapointe is doing third party testing on an installation, and there's a groundwater well under the drain field. And so we're getting 11.4 milligrams per liter out of the unit, and the concentration under the drain field is 5 milligrams per liter. So you're getting a little bit of additional denitrification through the drain field. At 5 milligrams per liter, you're under the state groundwater standard. So no minimum separation is required because you're already meeting the standard in the drain field.
Very good. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yes, sir. You're welcome.
Right. Any other last second questions?
I did have one. Is that okay?
Yes.
Alice White, Northport Commissioner. We actually voted recently to move forward with a design plan for our first septic to sewer conversion. Targeted area, 60% of the lots in this particular area have been developed. And yes, just like Debbie Carey from Punta Gorda said, it's it's been really difficult to put that across to people that this is the right thing to do. As you said, they're generally, those people are in the minority that want to do the right thing. But what I found now is there's a big push from the naysayers to have testing. They want to see water testing in the canals that run in that neighborhood, because they feel that if we're not polluting with our septic tanks, then we shouldn't have to convert. So any comments on that? Like, how do you address that? Or is that just again, having to educate people, because again, they're saying if our septic tanks are polluting, then you can't justify having this conversion, number one. And number two, how do you know we are polluting to Charlotte Harbor? I mean, and you mentioned that before, that it's everybody else, it's not us. But do you have any comment about the testing with that? Is that even?
Do you want me to jump in there, Jeff, and try to answer that? So testing is really expensive, and there's just a limited. For instance, we fund testing, but we fund it out in the estuaries, not up in the watershed sampling. And there's also problems because there's not established numeric nutrient criteria for tidal waters, and artificial waters are exempted. So really the way we assess things right now is we look at it downstream. We don't, and until the downstream water body is polluted to the point that it needs, corrective action, generally we don't always have the resources to start going upstream with our sampling. That being said, I mean, obviously a downstream water body being impaired, which we can readily show you how to find that information, is an indication that things flowing down into it are, not healthy at good, appropriate levels of nutrients. And if there were more funding, certainly there could be sampling done to reinforce that. But again, it's there's not like standards sometimes in the canal itself as to what would be. So it's hard to then, when you have multiple canals feeding into one water body where there is the standard, to then differentiate, how much is coming from each canal, if that makes sense. So
yeah, it does. But what they're pushing for is what they're calling, I think, point source, like that we want to know if we are the ones contributing to this, because in Northport, they do test the water, like you said, right before it enters the water plant on the Myakkahatchee Creek, because all the water leads to the creek. So this is why they haven't been testing in the canals, because it's all going to go there anyway, and that's where they're testing, because at that point they want to know before it goes through the treatment plant what they're dealing with. But people want to know. No, I want to know if our septics are contributing right here in this canal from our houses, and I'm just looking for ways to counter that.
Yeah.
I have a suggestion.
Okay, sorry. I'll just quickly say that Brian Lapointe's research, he hasn't done it for your canal, but he's done it for many canals in Southwest Florida. And I think the bottom line is it's not a point source. It's not like going to a pipe. It's non-point source, and it's coming through groundwater. So you have to use these tracers like that sucralose and then the levels to understand when it's coming through groundwater what the source is of that is. So it's complicated, but I certainly think that other research we can provide to you.
Yeah.
And then, if you're interested in trying to fund research, we'd be happy to help you in trying to build out a scope and look into that.
No, I'm just looking for ways to counter that, because I like that very first slide that was put up, that septic tanks pollute even when they are working. Okay, so that is what I'm going to use to sell the idea of that this is just something we need to do. And I like how you brought up that it's not a point source because it's groundwater contamination that we're talking about. So things like that, that's what I'm looking for.
I would add on that is that the groundwater eventually goes into surface waters. There's relationship, so people don't always know that.
Right.
But the groundwater flows laterally into surface waters in different areas. So they're linked.
Yes.
I think the data is important to some people, Alice, but I think, so I've been to a lot of town hall meetings now and talked to a lot of people, and I've heard a lot of these concerns, and I think that the septic tank politics are absolutely local politics, right? It's my septic tank, the problem. And I think I've heard the mayor respond a lot of different ways, and Mayor Rapopka has done a very effective job of communicating the purpose of this and why it's a good reason to participate, but he's also protecting himself from forcing somebody by saying this is voluntary. So it becomes a question of, how do you feel about your situation? And do you feel, compelled to act? And one of the things that that I think you might be able to use there, and this is an issue with Wekiva Springs. There are times when you can't see it, or you can't see to the bottom. It's too cloudy, and so he makes it about the waterway and try to make that emotional connection. And for Northport, you might ask the question, who here would be comfortable having their kids go swim in the canal? And if the answer is you don't, well then be thinking about signing up for this, because the more people sign up, the more the sooner these canals can be restored to the point where you can actually swim in them.
Right. Good point. Thank you.
Yes,
If you
thank you,
do
Jeff.
choose to sample, sucralose will be the easiest thing to identify it as wastewater. If you do not, if your plant is not near this, it will be the only thing that could be contributing would be the septic tanks. If your plant does contribute to that watershed, you'd also need to do some sampling for a constituent called iohexol. Iohexol is a contrast dye that typically is in and out of your body before you leave the hospital. So they've been able to, Joan Oppenheimer with Stantec's been able to establish a ratio that would separate reclaimed water discharges through groundwater from septic tank discharges through groundwater. But if you're in a canal that's got no reclaimed water contribution and there's sucralose there, it's those septic tanks.
Right. Thank you.
All right, I'll just mention that in Cudjoe, the facility that has done so well, they put the water down shallow well injection to start, but the community wanted it down in deep well, so there would be not even a milligram of nitrogen coming out to the surface waters from the groundwater. So that community really took it on and moved it forward. Thank you, Jeff. Really appreciate you coming in today, last minute, and bringing this up to help our region.
Thank you. Happy to do it.